Reservoir Dogs, Script and Screenplay Analysis, Part 8 of 12, by Sean McHugh, 2020 to 26. 36. Could Orange have avoided shooting a civilian driver? He shot her in response to her shooting him, but particularly as a policeman, he should instead have waited for White to get her to drop her gun, as White's already positioned behind her for this. While after successfully injuring and flooring Orange, she wasn't shooting him again. Orange is still holding a gun, however, so his best action after being shot is to drop it beside him while waiting for White, to show he's of no further threat at that point. White then has to diabolically dump the seriously injured woman and her baby taken from its crib on the pavement, its mother bleeding and dying next to it, before stealing the car and again prompting Orange's comment on the baby in the warehouse. The extremes of this horror are a match for Blonde's shootings and torture of Nash, and provide another parallel between White and Blonde, although then adding to White's distraught state of mind in contrast to Blonde as unperturbable, while the violence of all three cases is partially off-camera. Again, Orange fails to learn from his drug sub-story musings, where a sheriff almost shoots, but instead keeps composure enough not to shoot an innocent but confused citizen. Orange gets flustered, even as a criminal as well as a policeman, and shoots a confused civilian who is emotionally driven, with little chance in her situation, and should think better of what she's doing. Then later, when the police enter the warehouse, they repeatedly say to White holding Orange to drop his gun, in a reminder of the carjacking, where Orange should have dropped his gun, White should have told him to drop his gun, and White should have seen the driver reaching for the glove box and told her more quickly than he would have to drop her gun. Whereas Orange shouldn't shoot quickly, but does. Here, the police should shoot quickly, but don't, and instead, White shoots Orange. Alongside shooting her, causing unprofessional and grotesque civilian involvement, the bullet Orange fires goes through her and narrowly misses his boyfriend out the other window, although not visibly shown. White then expresses this subliminally when shouting hypocritically at Blonde and his inhumanity for shooting at the store, and taking his internal tension out on him as a substitute for Orange, who he wants to continue siding with out of his romantic relationship. White says, "Yes, I got a fucking problem. I got a big fucking problem with any trigger-happy madman who almost gets me shot." This is describing his subliminal worries about Orange, who he's fucking and emotionally invested in, being an undercover policeman, and then what happened with Orange in the carjacking, while Orange is further a madman in terms of a rash and unprofessional police officer. During this while has center stage, in the background, Pink staggers towards a white light the size of and immediately over his head, moves past it slightly, and comes back, where he then remains, all as his poor thinking as lacking grounds is dragged under White's illumination as basic false arguments to stay at the warehouse for Orange's sake and not get away as fast and far as possible. White then says with self-consciousness, "Asshole, if I knew what kind of guy you were, I never would have agreed to work with you." Again, White is speaking of gay Orange with his anal sex, where White's reasoning is confused, as well as subliminal, in that if he'd known Orange was a policeman, then he wouldn't have worked with him. This is on the wrong level, as a traitor on the team would instead be tortured to death, all as Blonde tries to do for Natch, just for being a policeman. Orange is in an appalled daze from White's police killings immediately before, and consequently gets shot by, and paradoxically shoots, a completely innocent person himself. Orange was expecting the robbers to be arrested, plus himself fake arrested outside the store, and for his subterfuge to be finished then. But instead, with the chaos and early police intervention at Blonde's shootings, it has to continue, and combined with his romantic relationship with White, he's at a disjunction and mentally unprepared for it. The driver wears a wedding ring, displaying it on camera by unnecessarily closing the glove box door as confirming her husband and family, which Orange is moronically wrecking, and in contrast to his wearing a fake wedding ring. Moreover, her car's name on the dash is a Pontiac, a lower-priced practical brand, indicating she's an ordinary person with an ordinary income. White looks gravely in a mirror to himself, positioning himself close to it, with the camera close, when talking to Pink about Blonde, but more poignantly describing exactly himself and Orange as asshole gay partners. A psychopath isn't a professional. Can't work with a psychopath. You don't know what those sick assholes are going to do next. In an indication of White's acceptance of there being a rat on the team, he also gets jittery when Pink reloads his gun during this. Yet if Pink was the rat, he likely wouldn't be telling him about it.
37. What's the driver's mistake? When someone is shot, they may not be neutralized or die immediately unless it's through the head, and by contrast can take hits all over the body, including the heart and even spine, and still fire back for a few minutes before succumbing. She's probably watched too many Hollywood films trivializing violence and showing people dropping dead instantly from any gunshot, and she only shoots Orange once instead of then aiming for his head, as likely costing her her life. Indeed, the woman and the events being set in and the film shot at real locations in Los Angeles, where Hollywood and its film fakery industry also is, conflates cinema and real life, while the dialogue often references Hollywood products. She's also misguidedly trying to deal with two armed and violent attackers, showing that unless people know what they're doing, legal gun ownership and responding to criminals in kind doesn't reduce crime or casualties. She's acting under emotion rather than reason to protect her baby, but White and Orange have designs only for her car and not the baby, her, or anything else, and meaning her correct gun use here was no gun use, and instead letting them take the car and looking to recover it later, as indeed would readily be possible.
38. What's Orange's mistake with his smugness over Joe giving out aliases? Orange smirks at Joe, reminding him to keep quiet under incognito rules, as helping with Orange being both undercover policeman and undercover gay lover, with Joe speaking of job security and homosexuality as contemptible, where Orange can also see himself as the Mr. Black Joe then talks about. He further smirks at Joe's concern to avoid fighting between robbers over the name Mr. Black, and saying they don't know each other, so nobody wants to back down, as the team only subliminally knowing the black or scheming and incognito White and Orange relationship, so they don't back down from their outward assumption that there is none.
Moreover, White doesn't know Orange's identity as policeman, or he'd back down from his support for him. Behind Orange is a phallic column, a ladder with its parallel connected sides, but with lower rungs missing as the gay relationship out of sight, and which then disappears and isn't seen again in the narrative, and the orange fire extinguisher and white waste bin here reflecting his plans to extinguish the romance and waste White after the robbery in a few hours. Orange is also under a dim orange light in the background, and beneath hanging rosemary on the far wall, as the song mentioned by the radio after the breakfast for Orange following White. This self-satisfaction, however, becomes Orange's undoing when he fails to learn from his intuitive musings and daydreams within his drug story sub-story, as encouraged by his manager giving it to him, and he gets shot. At the start of the meeting, Orange is the only one of the 8 smoking, dragging languorously as though it's the marijuana of his story, sitting back and slipping into pride before a fall, where his robber's persona that he's so pleased with, inside his superhero fantasy world, also deceives the woman with a gun. He quickly puts the cigarette out in noticing he's being overly cool, where the others have to listen carefully to the planning, while he knows he should be able to retreat to the waiting police regardless. Then after he slyly got White to break the rules in divulging his name and where he's from, White and Pink don't want to take him to a hospital. White will readily tell him as their lovers, despite them being incognito, and where White elaborates on his earlier talk in Smoky Pete's of betting on the Milwaukee Brewers, and hence confirming the manager's deduction that he's from Wisconsin. White surmises that if they can get in touch with Joe, or when he gets to the warehouse, he can arrange a doctor to see Orange, But Pink questions if he's coming, following the shootings that complicate the job, and instead they consider dropping Orange at a hospital, as he requests. As White outlines the situation with Orange, the shot includes on its far side 2 parts of 2 of the ceiling chains, one foreground and one background, for White and Orange, where each of the partners thinks about the other as chained together, and one speaking and one sick, and where the relationship is to the far side of their outward personas. These chains ascend higher up in later shots while remaining in their configurations. Pink first agrees, but rescinds on hearing of White's misgivings from his indiscretion in assessing more realistically than White the inevitable risk from Orange as a captured, compromised robber, and is ready to let him die in the warehouse. White has made it easier for Orange to pick him out from photos within a criminal record file that police have on him already, and with the robbers knowing what each other looks like being troublesome to begin with. However, Pink's thinking here still lags beyond the real situation, where if Orange is the rat infiltrator that Pink is certain they have and who he's already considering is Orange, the police would already have identified White. Orange's manager, following Orange's recruitment first meeting with Joe, Eddie, and White, has instructed him to put a name to the face, after guessing, like Pink, that White's hometown police have a file on him, and where both the manager and Pink use the word sheet. White then punches and kicks him, purely because of his attachment to Orange and emotional contortions, which he has to be guarded about, and thus surprises and confuses Pink, while Pink also later fails to think and explain this to himself. Joe's rules come to count drastically against Orange, and his smugness disappears, while moreover he spends much of the time lying, first on the car seats, then the warehouse, in terrible karmic retribution for spending most of the time lying to White, the other robbers, and his manager. 39. What should Orange have done before White shot the 2 policemen in the car? Orange understands that he could shoot White and save the policeman, but desists before seeing how disastrous his decision to take up a romance has become. He just reassures injured Brown that he's only got blood in his eyes, before Brown instead also dies, and in contrast to White's pragmatism about him. Orange stares dumbly at the deaths, and then a civilian shoots him, and White kills him, when he could have both saved the police and himself, and instead killed White, while also thereby likely saving the lives of Joe and Eddie, although probably not Nash from Blonde if Eddie with Pink alone left the warehouse to get the diamonds. Preceding the police killings, Orange is even holding his gun in the getaway car, then sees White preparing to shoot the approaching police from a fence corner, then has the gun at his side while standing as White shoots. Immediately behind him is more of the fence, as his thinking being fenced in and constrained by White, before White helps him forward in assuming he's shocked only because of youth and inexperience. Moreover, Orange should have been clearer with himself that once the robbery is done, as it is now, his relationship with White must end. When exiting the store with White, after being on door duty, he should have apprehended him there and thence retreated to the police, if he could do this without other robbers seeing, to allow them to continue on to the rendezvous point warehouse for Joe to attend and be captured later. Here, Joe in fact is discerning, via his police informant as emerging later, that Orange is a traitor, and wouldn't then attend, as Orange would have told the police the warehouse location, as revealed that morning, and he wouldn't be there for Joe to kill. But the store robbers don't know this, and throughout, Orange is lost in his emotions, and unclear with himself. Then, after Orange is failing here, when his undercover role should now be concluded, the car policemen have come to apprehend White, but he again fails to help them. There's no reason to return to the warehouse if he can get away earlier, and those still free still don't suspect him, but he blithely carries on under hazy emotionality. White insists strenuously to Orange, shot in the stomach in the carjacked car, that he's not dying and will be okay, but is totally wrong. He then gets no help, bleeds out, gets shot in the chest by Joe a second time, and then by White in the face and head for a third. Orange killed Blonde right before Blonde was going to kill a policeman, showing Orange can normally do his job as needed, but fails to do the same for White killing 2 policemen. However, Orange may further have failed to shoot Blonde at the store when Blonde was killing people. Although he was stationed at the outside door and may not have been able to see far inside, the sound of gunfire was enough concern for the waiting police outside to go in and intervene. Orange allowed them past, but at first was closer and able to act faster, instead desisting and keeping to his undercover role, and likely allowing innocent deaths. Moreover, no one thinks to question Orange, whose heist role was external door duty, over how he could possibly have avoided being apprehended or shot when the police entered and made their presence known, as Pink says, or why he seemingly did nothing to stop the police. 40. What are the first things to do for someone bleeding? In standard first aid, firstly, the area the casualty is in is checked as safe to proceed. Then their bleeding is stopped by rinsing the wound, applying pressure plus antiseptic, and closing it with bandages of some sort, as clean as possible. In parallel with this, Pink explains that he hid the diamonds in first checking the warehouse wasn't a police station and was safe to proceed, while also failing to notice police covertly stationed a block away, as Orange later tells Nash. Then White tells him to splash his face, before White also washes, but they fail to think of applying water to the man really needing it. White's use of washing here to deceive Pink into staying with them, with a view to getting help for Orange, and not properly considering infiltration, and thence suspecting Orange and them leaving quickly, distracts White from thinking more clearly and simply about what he needs to do to help Orange himself. The men know that bleeding is bad, and although none know what to do for him, nor that there is anything to do, also including Orange despite his police training and the blood scaring him, they lack the presence of mind then to work out they should at least stop it. Then any working environment has a first aid box by law, and which is very likely in the various wall cupboards next to White and Pink as they talk anxiously. Instead of rinsing and bandaging Orange, White has told him he can't do anything for him, and only shows him affection, and says time is on his side because it's painful more than serious. Although White talking later with Pink confirms he knows that he doesn't know, he thinks a doctor is needed to keep him alive for the night, but they only need to stabilize his condition. The bleeding injured can lose consciousness and bleed to death, but bandaging gives them much more time. They should also be placed flat to help blood flow to the head, and not with the head raised. And indeed, over time, Orange maneuvers himself off the ramp. Orange on the floor at the end shows his blood making the ramp into areas of orange, while the main dark gray surface has gained a contrasting white tinge, in parallel with the phallic intrusion of orange into white mortar brickwork of the wall outside the breakfast diner, plus similar features with Joe's office tusks and breakfast menu bars. Moreover, the ramp has an isolated orange section within its gray-white, as orange on the ramp now isolated from further activity. Orange himself turning white in the face as he loses blood, and not just his clothes and apartment, reflects his misplaced affinity for White and how deathly wrong that has gone, while his white shirt instead turning bright orange is him coming back to himself, but in gravest terms. His collar remains white, and still with his Mr. Black tie on. The shirts of the other two gays, White and Blonde, similarly become bloodied and orange, with Blonde's completely orange at his death. Secondary infection entering an open wound, however, can be more serious than either the bleeding or wound orange, is lying on a surface of dirt and bacteria, which, without bandage and with direct access to his system, will kill him. White produces a clean white handkerchief from his jacket, but only touches Orange's forehead with it before putting it on the dirty floor, then becoming another white and orange messy mix from uselessly wiping Orange's red blood, as reflecting White's mixed-up thinking. There are also clean paper towels, plus a clean cloth towel in the side room, as even colored orange to suggest its use for Orange, but they don't think. White shows some awareness of first aid in checking Orange's breathing, by listening and placing Orange's metal cigarette lighter by his mouth and nose to look for fogging, but then continues arguing with Pink. Orange is seen pocketing his cigarettes and lighter from his apartment's table when leaving for the heist, before White takes them to help stall Pink. The subsequent discussion and vehement arguments over Orange's condition and White divulging personal details are secondary. And moreover, although White tells Orange to wait for Joe to arrive and bring help, Joe then, by contrast, arrives to shoot and kill Orange.
White would have supported Orange's recruitment at the Smoky Pete's bar meeting, where he and Orange perceived each other's sexuality and developed an attraction. And indeed, the four socialize a second time, as perhaps encouraged by White, and perhaps at the same bar, where Orange is able to give his drug story. Joe here is involving White in the store robbery recruitment, which means that White and Orange, uniquely among the six, know each other before the day of the robbery, despite Joe's strident concerns for team anonymity, and resulting in White favoring Orange as both undercover lover and then serendipitously for Orange as policeman. To be continued.